Many of the sculptors and architects of the ancient world were initiates of the mysteries, particularly the Eleusinian rites. Since the dawn of time, the truers of stone and the hewers of wood have constituted a divinely inspired caste. The profound knowledge of mathematics and astronomy embodied in ancient architecture and the equally profound knowledge of anatomy revealed in Greek statuary prove that the fashioners of both were masterminds, deeply cultured in the wisdom which constituted the arcana of the mysteries. Thus was established the Guild of the Builders, progenitors of modern Freemasons. When employed to build palaces, temples, or tombs, or to carve statues for the wealthy, those initiated architects and artists concealed in their works the secret doctrine. So that now, long after their bones have returned to dust, the world realizes that those first artisans were indeed truly initiated and worthy to receive the wages of Master Mason. The most celebrated of the ancient fraternities of artisans was that of the Dionysiac architects. This organization was composed exclusively of initiates of the Bacchus Dionysius cult and was peculiarly consecrated to the science of building and the art of decoration. Acclaimed as being the custodians of a secret and sacred knowledge of architectonics, its members were entrusted with the design and erection of public buildings and monuments. The superlative excellence of their handiwork elevated the members of the guild to a position of surpassing dignity. They were regarded as the master craftsmen of the earth. They made their appearance certainly not later than 1000 BC, which interestingly Freemasons will trace their origins to the building of King Solomon's temple, which occurred right around 1000 BC. And they appear to have enjoyed particular privileges and immunities. They also possessed secret means of recognition and were bound together by special ties only known to themselves. They were divided into communities governed by a master and wardens. They held a grand festival annually and were held in high esteem. Their ceremonials were regarded as sacred. They had means of intercommunication all over the then known world. And from them, doubtless, sprang the guilds of traveling masons known in the Middle Ages. Freemasonry, most of all, owes to the Dionysiac cult the great mass of its symbols and rituals, which are related to the science of architecture. From these ancient and illustrious artisans, it has also received the legacy of the unfinished temple of civilization, that vast invisible structure upon which these initiated builders have labored continuously since the inception of the fraternity. This mighty edifice, which has fallen and been rebuilt time after time, but whose foundations remain unmoved, is the true everlasting house of which the temple on the brow of Mount Moriah was but an impermanent symbol. And that would be the reference to King Solomon's temple. This image is particularly compelling. This is an image that's prevalent in the Masonic order. I'm sure Warren and Ryan have seen this. We have Father Time representing oftentimes Saturn. Remember Saturn, Kronos, right? He has there a great scythe or sickle. And you have this maiden who is weeping over a broken column. She holds in her left hand the ciborium, the grail, sealed with the blood, the royal blood, the holy blood. In her right hand, she holds the acacia, a symbol of rejuvenation and everlasting life. But we also know it's the source of something else. How many of you know? Stephen, what is it?
DMT.
It's the source of DMT. And then we have the hourglass. Notice he's also plaiting or braiding her hair. Long hair. That's a clue. There are several things here that are clues. One is this. We were talking in the first part of this talk about comets, weren't we? Cometa, from the Latin and the Greek, means long-haired. Long-haired. So Because early people seeing comets envisioned a person, usually a maiden, with long hair flowing out, which was the tail of the comet. The broken column, that represents civilization. Aside from the operative aspect of their order, the Dionysiac architects had a speculative philosophic code. Human society they considered as a rough and untrued ashlar. That is the stone when it's first removed from bedrock, only lately chiseled from the quarry of elemental nature. This crude block was the true object upon which these skilled craftsmen labored, polishing it, squaring it, and with the aid of fine carvings, transforming it into a miracle of beauty, because there was a whole process that had to transpire between extracting stone, that rough ashlar, before it could be fitted as part of the cathedral. We have two columns here, part of the 5 architectural orders. Warren, what is the architectural order of these columns? Corinthian, yes. Corinthian is characterized by the foliage emerging from the top of the column. And this indicates a very profound philosophical idea that was held in mind by these builders of old. That is, the stones were erected in such a way that they were like living stones, conduits of literal energy. And that energy, once it was assembled in the right place, with the right orientation, with the right materials, that energy could ascend the column, and that was actually living energy. And so the metaphorical explosion of foliage at the top of the column represents this idea that the life force is traveling up the columns, infusing the temple itself. That's what this is telling you right here. While mystics released their souls from the bondage of matter by meditation, and philosophers found their keenest joy in the profundities of thought, these master workmen achieved liberation from the wheel of life and death by learning to swing their hammers with the same rhythm that moves the swirling forces of the cosmos. Now that's a whole different way of approaching the art of building than prevails today, when it's like, we got a budget, we got to come in under budget, we got to earn a profit. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. And in fact, I think you can still keep all that in mind, but you have to add this higher dimension to it. And then it transmorphs into something else. They venerated the deity under the guise of the great architect and master craftsman who was ever gouging rough ashlars from the fields of space and truing them into universes. The Dionysians affirmed constructiveness to be the supreme expression of the soul, and attuning themselves with the ever-visible, constructive natural processes going on around them, believed immortality could be achieved by thus becoming a part of the creative agencies of nature. So the question then is that what would be the form of work that we would undertake in this age in which we find ourselves? We're going to have to skip a few things because there's a whole lot, like Ed. The frustrating part is we never have enough time. But I'm using my website, my podcast, to dive deep into all of these things, to explore some of the tangents and the byways and the, going off the main trunk. One of the things, the analogies that I use, and it's kind of my own, probably others have used it, but, because I'm so geologically oriented, I kind of think of this stream of knowledge, a stream of wisdom, as a great underground river. And from time to time, this river emerges from the surface and flows underground, above ground. And when that happens, civilization prospers, it flowers, all kinds of good things happen. If we go back to the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, during the building of the Gothic period, interestingly, we see population increase, we see lifespans increase, we see diminishing of debilitating diseases, we see a diminishing of infant mortality. We actually see the stature of Europeans increasing during that period of time by 3 to 4 inches on average, right? That period came to an end. It was followed by the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age. And the world went from warmth to cold. Crops died in the fields, and people went hungry. And it's the same repeat of what happened in the 500s, in the year 500s, when the year 536 AD, paleoclimatologists have looked at that and said, that year, 536 AD, appears to have been the coldest year of the last 2,000 years. And it was followed by a decade of cold that gripped the planet. And in fact, dendrochronologists who study tree rings were able to discern that for 10 years, almost all forest growth stopped because it went from fat rings to very almost indiscernible skinny rings because they weren't getting enough warmth and moisture, and they just stopped growing. That decade was enough to launch the world into 300 years of the Dark Ages. That one decade. What brought that on? It's questionable. I think there were several agencies probably involved. There's 2 great impact craters, one off the coast of Norway, one off the coast of New Zealand, appear to date right from that period. There was also a spasm of global volcanism that may have actually been related to those impact events. So, what does that lead us to? Well, it leads us to this. If we go back and we talk about the Holy Grail and the quest basically ended with the great Battle of Camelon, where Arthur was killed. The date of that battle is usually given by historians as between 540 and 542 AD. Interestingly, after 6 or 7 years of the cold and the crops dying in the fields and people going hungry, you had, in 542 AD, the Justinian plague that wiped out almost half the population of Europe. And it took 300 years to recover from that. And then you had a similar thing that happened in the early 1300s. And we see that the return of the cold into the world coincides precisely with the end of the great Gothic building enterprise. And in, like I said, 1340, right in around there, you had the bubonic plague that again wiped out 1/3 to half the population of Europe. And here we have Beauvais and Bourges. You can see how amazing these are as we go through some of this. Chartres Cathedral. You can't even begin to fathom the amount of meaning and symbolism that's been encoded into this one structure. From the great rose window up above the door, 12 petals representing the 12 signs of the zodiac and the cosmic journey. The 2 towers, one dedicated to the solar energy, one dedicated to the lunar energy. The ground plan itself, which is based upon the proportions of the root 3 that I was talking about earlier, which comes from the geometric symbol of the Vesica Piscis, which is the supreme symbol of the feminine. And it's from the Vesica that the entire edifice of Euclidean geometry emerges. It begins with the drawing of 2 circles, as I've shown repeatedly in my classes. And that length to width ratio is the root 3. And there's the Vesica that defines that length to width ratio. St. Mary's Chapel that I mentioned before, that's on the west end of Glastonbury. I said its width was 39.6 and its length was 68.6. If you do the math, you'll discover it's the square root of 3 relationship. So it too is based upon that. And it's appropriate, dedicated to Mary, that it would embody the feminine geometry. I'm going to go through some of this. Okay, so here's the ground plan. Yeah, there you see the 39.6. Now, 39.6, we determined earlier that our Glenn, right? You still got, okay, 7920 diameter of the Earth, diameter. Radius is half that number, right? So divide 7920 by 2. And how many miles in the radius of the Earth? 3960. 3,960. Coincidence that 39.6 feet is the width of Mary's Chapel. Stonehenge, right? There's the Sarsen stone circle. There's the great lintels. And here is the ground plan. And check this out. Sarsen stone circle, 100.8 feet. Outer face, 105.6. Divide that by 2 and there's your 52.8, which is 1/100th of a mile. Average length of the Sarsen stone lintels, 10.56 feet. The number of Sarsen stone lintels, 30. So the bluestone circle, which is this, the smaller circle, here's its 79.2 feet. And the bluestone horseshoe, which is this, is laid out on a circle of 39.6. So in other words, this circle here, upon which this was laid out, is precisely the same size as the original chapel at Glastonbury, 39.6 feet. And that preserves an earth number, the radius of the earth. So, but there's more than that going on here that we don't have time to get into today, but it's all part of this sacred geometry. You can see here's some of the geometry utilized. And now notice the bluestone circle, which I've kind of done with actually a blue circle here. The Sarsen stone circle, if you draw this on the center of the stones, now the thickness of the stones is very carefully worked out. You've got the center of the stones and you've got the facing of the stones, so you can get two different ways of measuring, just like you've got two different ways of measuring the Great Pyramid. One, the pyramid on the circle, and then on the other one, the pyramid with the cornerstones in place, which they're not there anymore, but you can still see the indentations in the bedrock that held those stones. So you can actually measure the perimeter of the base two different ways. Anyways, but if you take this difference between these two circles right here, and you use that as a radius and draw a circle, as I've done here, it has the same proportions as the Earth to the Moon, precisely. And if we take St. Mary's Chapel, exactly dimensioned, juxtapose it on this diagram of Stonehenge, it fits exactly in here. And furthermore, if you take the axis of St. Mary's Chapel, which is angled just a little bit north of the parallel, and you draw that line, it targets Stonehenge, an example of sacred geography. So there's a lot going on here. Parthenon, it fits into a perfect golden rectangle. And this is showing some of the internal geometry. And we could go into a lot of this, which I'm saving for my classes and my online stuff, and we don't have time today. So I'm going to jump over real quick and talk about the idea. I'll just show this one thing here. This is the Shiloh Mound Complex, which is actually in Tennessee. And this is the ground plan of it. And I've studied quite in depth. At some point, Bradley and I think are going to organize a tour of the extant earthworks that are still here in North America. But this Shiloh complex, this is showing the layout of the complex, and then juxtaposed over that is the Pleiades.